Someone stops talking to you. No explanation. No fight, sometimes not even a bad conversation before it. Just silence. And you spend weeks replaying every text, every interaction, trying to find the crime you supposedly committed. Here's what almost nobody tells you: the silence often has nothing to do with you at all. It's a symptom of something the other person has been carrying since long before they met you. And once you understand where it comes from, it stops feeling like punishment and starts feeling like information. Carl Jung spent decades studying what he called the shadow, the parts of ourselves we refuse to look at directly. He believed that the ways people cope under emotional pressure are rarely random. They're old patterns, formed early, repeating themselves on a loop. The silent treatment is one of these patterns. It looks like control. It looks like coldness. But underneath, Jung's framework suggests it's usually fear wearing a mask. In the next few minutes, you'll learn the real psychological root of this behavior, the specific childhood pattern that creates it, and, near the end, the one sign that tells you whether the silence is a wound talking or something more deliberate. Stay with me, because that distinction changes everything. Let's start with the moment it happens. You say something. Maybe it was a disagreement. Maybe it was barely anything, a joke that landed wrong, a boundary you set, a question you asked. And instead of a response, you get a wall. No anger, no yelling. Just absence. Your instinct is to chase it. To apologize for something you're not even sure you did. This is the first thing to understand: silence is not neutral. It is a communication, just one that refuses to use words. Jung would say the person retreating into silence is protecting an old wound, not punishing a new one. The trigger might be small. The reaction is disproportionate because it isn't really about the trigger. It's about every other time they felt unsafe expressing anger directly, and learned that going quiet was safer than speaking. Which brings us to where this pattern actually starts. Almost always, it starts in childhood. Picture a home where emotions were unwelcome. Where a child's anger was met with punishment, or worse, with more anger. In that kind of home, a child learns fast that expressing frustration out loud is dangerous. So they find another way to survive the feeling. They go quiet. They disappear into themselves. Silence becomes armor. It's not chosen consciously, it's a strategy the nervous system builds to keep the child safe. And nervous systems don't update their strategies just because the person turns 30, or 40, or 60. The armor stays on. Which means the adult in front of you, who won't answer your texts for 4 days after a small disagreement, might genuinely be operating from the wiring of a much younger version of themselves. Understanding this doesn't excuse the behavior. But it explains why reasoning with it rarely works. You can't argue someone out of a nervous system response. Now here's where it gets more specific, and more useful. Jung described a concept called the persona, the mask we show the world versus the self underneath it. People who use silence as a shield often have an unusually rigid persona. On the outside, they may seem calm, composed, even unbothered. Friends might describe them as chill or easygoing. But that calm exterior is frequently covering something much less settled underneath. Silence, in this light, isn't the absence of emotion. It's emotion with nowhere safe to go. Think about the people you know who go quiet under stress. Are they usually the loudest people in the room, or the ones who seem to have everything together? Often it's the latter. The composed ones. Because composure, for them, was never a personality trait, it was a survival requirement. Here's something worth sitting with for a second, and we'll come back to it later: not everyone who goes silent is protecting themselves. Some people have learned that silence is a weapon, not a wound. And telling these two apart is harder than you'd think, but there is one clear signal that separates them. Hold on to that thought, because it matters more than anything else in this video. Let's talk about what the silence is actually trying to protect. Jung believed most defensive behavior exists to guard something the person can't consciously name, usually shame. Not guilt, which says, "I did something bad." Shame, which says, I am something bad. A person operating from guilt can apologize and move forward. A person operating from shame often can't even look at the situation directly, because looking at it means confronting a belief about themselves that feels unbearable. So instead of saying, I'm overwhelmed, or, I feel like I failed you, they disappear. Disappearing feels safer than being seen as flawed. This is why arguments with a silent treatment-prone person often escalate the wrong way. You want resolution. They want to vanish until the shame passes. Two completely different needs, operating on two completely different timelines. Now think about what this means for you, on the receiving end. If you've ever been ghosted mid-relationship, frozen out by a friend, or met with days of silence from a parent after a disagreement, you've probably done what most people do, you assumed it was about you. You searched for your mistake. You over-apologized. You shrank yourself to make the silence end faster. But if Jung's framework is right, most of that chasing was aimed at the wrong target. You were trying to solve a problem with an old wound that has nothing to do with the current moment. This is one of the most common relationship patterns nobody warns you about, two people fighting completely different fights, each one convinced the other understands what's happening. There's also a quieter cost to this pattern that rarely gets mentioned. The person going silent isn't just withholding words from you. Jung would argue they're also withholding a part of themselves from themselves. Every time silence is chosen over honesty, the shadow gets a little heavier. The unspoken feeling doesn't disappear, it goes underground, and it tends to resurface later, often bigger and messier than it would have been if it had just been said out loud in the first place. This is why people who rely on silence as their default coping mechanism often describe feeling exhausted, even when nothing happened. They're not resting during the silence. They're managing an internal storm alone, without letting anyone, including themselves, see how loud it actually is. So how do you tell the difference between someone protecting an old wound, and someone using silence deliberately to control you? Here's the distinction Jung's framework points toward, and it's simpler than you'd expect. Wounded silence comes with discomfort on both sides, the person withdrawing is also suffering, even if they can't show it. They often return changed, softer, sometimes even ashamed of how long they stayed quiet. Weaponized silence comes with comfort on one side only. The person withholding feels a quiet sense of power the longer it lasts. They don't return changed. They return once they've made their point. One is a nervous system in survival mode. The other is a nervous system that has learned silence gets results, and is using it on purpose. The wound flinches. The weapon waits. That's the line. If you've ever been on the receiving end of the second kind, you already know it feels different in your body. It doesn't feel like grief. It feels like being tested. And your instincts, even before your mind catches up, are usually right about which one you're dealing with. Here's the piece that changes how most people think about this entirely. We tend to treat silence as the opposite of communication. Jung's work suggests the opposite is true. Silence is often the most honest thing a wounded person does, because it's the one behavior they haven't learned to perform. Words can be rehearsed. Words can be chosen to manage how you're perceived. But silence, the real kind, the kind rooted in shame rather than strategy, is involuntary. It's the nervous system overriding the desire to seem fine. Which means the very behavior that feels like the coldest rejection is sometimes the most unfiltered, unguarded thing a person has shown you. Not because they don't care. Because they care so much that pretending became impossible, and disappearing felt like the only honest option left. That reframe doesn't mean you have to accept being shut out indefinitely, or that you owe endless patience to every silence you encounter. But it does mean the story you've been telling yourself, that you did something unforgivable, that you're being punished, is very often the wrong story. The real story, more often, is someone's oldest fear showing up in your relationship, uninvited, and taking the only shape it knows how to take. Notice the pattern in your own relationships. Notice who goes quiet, and whether they return changed or return victorious. That single observation will tell you more about the people around you than 100 conversations ever could. If this gave you a new way to look at someone who's gone quiet on you, let me know in the comments who came to mind while you were watching. And if you want to understand the other side of this pattern, why some people can't stop talking when they're anxious instead of going silent, that video is waiting for you next.